Well, my talk will be very, very short since there will be a lot of talking during these 2 days. However, I just want to say a few words about the context of this 2 days. Knowing that I'm not a curator, Catherine Klingen generously invited me to create the third week of this event. After thinking a lot, the final idea that I came up with was very simple and maybe a selfish one. It is to invite my friends, whom I missed a lot, and also who I highly admire their works. So I invited them to be with me in this event, and unluckily, I could not invite all my friends, so luckily next time. And the idea is that to present all of us a series of non-academic lectures. And the non-academic lecture is a term that I personally would prefer to use rather than using the unknown one, the lecture performance. And the arguments for this preference are many. I tried to mention a lot of them in the program that you already got, and if you are not, then you can get it from there. Although all of us are Lebanese, but this does not mean that we represent Lebanon or its artistic and cultural scene. Each one of us will give a non-academic lecture that represents his own reading and reflections and the history of Lebanon and the region. However, far from any conclusions, far from the discourses that are ready for media consumption, hopefully so, and far from any political mobilization. This is important. And of course, this brief introduction does not answer the question posed in the title of the event, why we are here now. I would suggest to postpone this answer and our individual answers till the last session that will be at the ending of these 2 days, and where there will be one panel gathering all the participants, among them myself, and it will be an open to you and to your interventions, doubts, and questions as well. So you are all welcome, actually, to start debating with us and thinking with us. At the end, I would like to thank the Haus der Kulturen der Welt for inviting me. Thank you, Bern. Thank you, Catherine. And thanks also to the wonderful team at the HKW who helped me to achieve this program. So thanks, Zdravka, Emily, Claudia, Leona, Yvonne, Kristen, and thanks, Quirin, Nadia, Hardy, Tassos, Grigor, Mark, Adrian, Sebastian, and actually the list is very long, so thanks for everyone helped us to do this. Also, I would like to thank my friends that they joined me to this event, and I have to say it was hard to bring them here. So thank you, Ahmad, Huda, thank you, Munira, Lina, Khalil, Akram, Walid, Lawrence, Joanna, thank you. And finally, I would like also to thank all of you. I would have loved to know you by names to say it. Thank you so much, and I hope you will enjoy. Good evening.
Mesdames et messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends,
sur un immense mur blanc,
on a huge white wall, Rabbi Mroué had deployed some months ago 366 tiny images, press cuttings, or at least seeming to have been cut out of the press. Some of them were a bit bigger than others, but all of them were of a comparable size and had identical frames. The color colors were not totally absent. A color image searched here or there discreetly, just enough to break up the monotony and suggesting partial sets. Tones of black and gray stayed dominated, and some small texts slipped furtively among the images, gave the impression to be press cuttings as well. However, to try to read them, you became discouraged quickly because the segments were garbled deliberately and the pretend text was illegible, but maintained maybe a certain temptation to decipher it. But the text remained an image like the others rather than a discursive sequence. These images that were so numerous and so small, and sometimes so much simplified that there were only a frame filled with black. Because they were so condensed, they gave the impression to be hieroglyphs, words disguised in images. And starting from there, you could imagine a game, or even play it if you had the strength to master the vertigo that a prolonged and laborious visit to this wall would give the viewer. I would like to tell you about the game that I imagined the evening of the opening night in Beirut of Rabbi Mouez's last exhibit. This evening, and maybe it was even some days before, I don't remember. And I am also going to disclose, of course, which analogy I am finding so obvious between this game and the discursive management of a chronic paralysis that shakes the Lebanese political system for so many years now, even several decades, one might say. This paralysis, and not Rabbi Mouez's exhibit, is actually the topic of the speech that I have undertaken to give you today. However, before I make those comparisons, I have to signal a fact, or those comparisons are commonplace as well as enlightening. Our artist has a thick book called Sanakabis, meaning leap year, another reproduction of those same press cuttings that he had stuck to the big wall of the Beiruti gallery. But this book is not the exact copy of the wall. One might even say that from a certain viewpoint it is the exact opposite. The book is actually a calendar, a journal, and each page represents a day of the year. Often they are too small to fill the whole page. And the image that is shown here is rather a symbol or name of the given day. The wall, if you look at it from far, can be seen as a whole in one look. And then you would come closer to scrutinize the details. The book, however, can be browsed. The pages come one after the other in the same time that it takes to view it. And to speak with a Saussurian distinction, the images on the wall are synchronous, while the images in the book are, for the reader at least, diachronic. And synchrony is suitable for the game that I'm going to propose. We want to look through a magnifying glass at one of the images, a randomly picked image or an overexposed image. This way, a certain number of the surrounding images are going to align around it. This structure is improvised and maybe too loose, so it can be modified at will. For instance, reduce the number of elements, or reduce the spontaneous frame, or detail the whole in lines that emanate from the dominating image and contain a limited number of elements. This process is particularly interesting if we think about the idea that those images are similar to hieroglyphs, meaning to words. Even without a Rosetta Stone, I suppose that some of the lines that you obtain could be converted into sentences or periphrases that make sense, and others would have no detectable coherence and would remain analog to small drafts that some of those cuttings scattered on the wall represent. Of course, it remains possible, especially if you are frustrated by a first tentative, to start over and change the dominating image and the spontaneous gestalt. With its 366 images, the wall offers an unlimited number of potential recompositions, total or partial. In what way does this game resemble the Lebanese political system, which, as I've already said, has been struggling for a long time in a crisis with changing configurations that are apparently insoluble? According to me, this crisis is aligned around one word, Altai Via, the communitarianism, or if you want to keep its French equivalent that is a bit obsolete, confessionalism. In a configuration that is inspired from Rabbi Mouret's exhibit, this word would be the central point around which the lines radiate that represent an arrangement that is possible of political forces in our post-war era. The central word could be enhanced or lit at will, and one arrangement would be highlighted in order to underline that it is the most recent, and suitable treatment would be given each of the others in order to mark their place in the series, its importance, and so on. And finally, parentheses, plus and minus signs, arrows, and so on would transform those arrangements into a formula, an equation of the crisis, a stage given at a given time of its evolution. Why would I keep the possibility to change the lighting or the caliber of the central word? Well, because the same treatment is given in real politics, but without ever losing its central position. Almost 40 years ago already, I called this phenomenon modesty of communities. And what I meant by that was the general trend of the political forces in Lebanon, be it the forces at power, to disparage the communitarian system that they belong to, and to consider it as a necessary evil, and recommending in most of the cases to overcome it as soon as certain conditions were given. And at that time, I said that this modesty, far from being pure deceit, would help to avoid the collisions between communities and even to leave some space for the state. Did the Lebanese war, whose intercommunitarian dimension became with time more and more invasive, overcome the modesty of the communities? Yes, since it instaured political forces that were openly communitarian and took over practically the representation of their respective communities. And from then on, arbitration powers in the institutions could be, because it needed supremacy, be assimilated to a communitarian domination. While the war had weakened its legitimacy. The Syrian power, with troops that were flanked by security services and controlled the articulations in Lebanon, took over 15 years the function of referee of the Lebanese disputes that sometimes it created or revived. And at the same time, it reshuffled, according to its own interest, the Lebanese political scene and excluded practically the two Christian groups that were the most important. With the blessing of the Iranian powers, created a suitable division of labors that pleased both groups that from then on monopolized the representation of the Shiites, and gaining cooperation from Saudi Arabia in the reconstruction of the country against the control of that operation by a Sunnite billionaire whose links to Riyadh were unwavering. These developments took place at a point in time when American supremacy, after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Second Gulf War, were a given. The process became lame quickly. The peace process launched in Madrid between Israel and the Arab world, but was still breathing. This whole situation was progressively shaken by the injured Christian party and also by the threatened Sunnite party. Hariri was ousted by the new president under the Syrian godfather, and who was placed as head of state in 1998. But he managed to come back as president of the council after a landslide election in 2000. Christian personalities followed the example of the dignitaries of the Maronite Church and claimed openly, after the Israeli retreat from the occupied South Lebanon, to redeploy, as was enshrined in the Taif Agreement, of Syrian troops to prepare their total retreat from Lebanon and to finish dissolving the militias, meaning to disarm Hezbollah. Maronite archbishops had asked in their appeal for a third claim and promised to become a post-war Christian leitmotif, the electoral reform that would allow Christians to choose their own representatives. After the Clinton-Assad summit failed in March 2000, the Syrian withdrawal from the peace process fostered the convergence of two opposing currents at the oppositions to the Syrian domination, and led to a hardening of the Syrian attitude to American hegemony and the regional clientele. After 9/11, Assad's son, who continued to support the jihad, the Iraqi jihad against the American occupation, revived Washington's hostility to the Syrian regime. And preparing the presidential elections, the Resolution 1559 of the UN Security Council, adopted in September 2004, reiterated sovereignist revendications of the Christian camp that Hariri was now suspect of adopting. But Bashar al-Assad was determined to extend the mandate of the president in exercise for the next 3 years. And the UN resolution finished to prepare the political scene in Lebanon for the upheavals in 2005. Now, to come back to Mroué's montage, we could say that 1990 to 2005 were years where the modesty of communities showed incredible equity in the two camps, the pro-Syrian powers and the opposition to this power. The vocabulary of the national liberation and of the national reconstruction tried to hide the communitarian character of the balances of resistance to Israeli occupants and the redistribution of resources that followed the reconstruction. However, the opposition had from the beginning an openly Christian character and was implicitly joined in 1998 by Hariri, who had become frankly Sunnite. One might suppose that the central notion of communitarianism, hidden on the one hand and highlighted on the other. The line emanating from this notion should be replaced by an angle. On the top, Hariri, and radiating from him on both sides, the names or the symbols of the political forces and those that were in power and the opposition. But where would the Syrian referee stand? Well, I think we should make him hold the magnifying glass or the torch, because they actually had the power to increase one and also to send another one to jail. After the historic assassination of Rafik Hariri on 14 February 2005, the two mass demonstrations on March 8th and 14th showed two opposing attitudes to the retreat of the Syrian troops. The legislative elections right after this retreat caused a notable change in the political situation. And beyond electoral opportunism embodied by the quadripartite alliance that regrouped during the campaign only great adversaries of those demonstrations that each had for symbol the date of the demonstration that they mobilized, took over for a decade the political scene of the country. The power, of course, but also the opposition exercised sometimes even from inside the power. This duality brought something new. It was to present all groups, all representations of communities as irreplaceable to the government, meaning to practically exclude all stable formulas of government other than one that would unite them all. And already the end of the war in 1919 had put a single party at the head of each of the main communities, so that without the Syrian diktat, the exclusion of one of those groups from a governmental formula was enough to destroy the legitimacy of the new government. The government had tried to gain the trust of a parliamentary majority, but it still was accused of giving the representation to one of the basic components of the country, to a usurper. This happened in June 2011 when the Druze leader Walid Jombla deserted the coalition of March 14 and allowed the Tripolitan rival Saad Hariri to replace him at the head of the government that had been very laborious to shape. And the Mikati government was very slow from the start because the rights holder, the Sunnite rights holder, had been replaced by another that was much less representative. And the Syrian referee had gone and could not impose such balance in the name of a supranational interest that it had. And to paint the picture of 2005, there are some other news. The Hezbollah, who had been content since the end of the war to be represented in parliament, is now going to be part and parcel of all the governments, in a bloc with Amal, the other Shiite group. Together, they represent a sustainable example of a lack of alternative that normally makes it impossible to do without any of the great parties that are at the head of the power. Even the Christians, with their two rival parties who had controlled a large majority of the parliamentary representation, thought they were injured when the political conjuncture dropped their share of power into the hands of one single group. Their ministers were representing only a weak majority or a strong minority, so they found themselves weakened, especially considering the representativity of the Shiite duo. Hezbollah had remained, by the way, armed during all this time, and during those 2 years showed that they were capable of sending the country into an international war, and they would not hesitate if the government would call it back to elementary sovereignty to seize the capital. So it is not surprising that some years later Hezbollah did not even need to ask anybody in Lebanon before they started to engage on the sides of the Syrian regime in the conflict that we know. The ultimate reality that the evacuation of the country by the Syrian troops revealed showed that the same political groups, exclusive representatives of the principal communities, all constitute the same government, or almost, at each election. Of course, no government ever was really removable, and the governments that the country has had since 2005 have turned out to be quite different. And those differences that are due to conjunctural developments or constitutional elections have not stopped the country from struggling in a systemic crisis that seems to have no end. The governments, be it national union or a big coalition, have limited their productivity and have been threatened regularly to implode. The 8 Mars ministers and the 14 Mars ministers are swapping, according to the different subjects, the paradoxical role of intragovernmental opposition. And the governments with a limited majority always have a dangerous deficit of communitarian legitimacy. By the way, be it one or the other of those two formulas, the Lebanese have become used to wait for months for a new government to replace the one that has stepped down. And the same goes for the presidents of the Republic. Two have managed to extend their mandate, and the two last ones have not been able to be elected until after the position of head of state had remained vacant for a long time. The promised elections are going to take place in the spring of 2018. The legislative power that has had the same president for 25 years is going to be renewed after 9 years only instead of normally 4 years. And especially with long governmental or presidential vacancy, the parliament as well has known long periods of lethargy. But the modesty of communities could not help suffering during the last 10 years. The main political parties each had their communitarian identity and an ambition to transgress the borders of the community had disappeared. For instance, the electoral law, draft law that was presented in 2013 by the Orthodox Assembly and that was finally voted by the Maronite dignitaries and the main Christian political parties. Great party that would be mono-communitarian could probably not maintain a network of clients and allies, except if they found them in other communities. Old like parties were shrunken more than ever, and the Saudi sponsorship of 14 March and Irano-Syrian sponsorship of 8 March only increased the Sunnite Shiite dimension of the confrontation. On the one side of the barricade, a series of political assassinations deepened the bloody gap that was very hard to bridge. The prosecution brief of the Special Tribunal for the Lebanon indicted members of Hezbollah in the assassination of Hariri and went in the same direction. First, this chain of crimes, of which the assassination of Hariri was the main link, started to appear openly confessional. When an important partner of 14 Mars, the Aounist current, defected to the opposing camp, the Islamo-Christian character of the confrontation was maybe mitigated and added a bit of Christian water to the wines of 8 Mars that started to be highly concentrated in Shiite components. By the way, Hariri's current, who was at the head of 14 March, was also concerned. The regional conjunction started to look like a Sunnito-Shiite duel was renewing the Lebanese situation from the bottom. It is so improbable that the Lebanese war would become violent again. The political fight after the war of 2006 and the occupation of Beirut in May 2008 strengthened the principally intra-Muslim character of this new trench. To come back to the scene that gave me this idea, the famous wall of Rabbi Moué, I'm finding it very relevant for the period 2005-2016 to attach the symbols of the Lebanese parties to either side of a trench with enhanced symbol of political communitarianism. One might imagine Michel Aoun jumping from over the trench and Walid Jumbla, who would prefer to keep one foot on either side. Now reduced to the part of brilliant second in command by the rise of Hezbollah and its intrusion into the governmental sphere, Nabi Berri could be placed as under the General Secretary of this party, and so on. Since the Hezbollah intervention in Syria, that unilaterally overpassed the abstentionist consensus sealed by the Babda Declaration and co-signed by this party, the draft in 2005 of the Lebanese confrontation seems to progressively come to an end. The development of the Syrian conflict and the Saudi disengagement of Lebanese affairs are weakening the 14 Mars party, and so much that this name is now even being considered obsolete by them. Reconciliation between the Free Patriotic Current and the Lebanese forces in January 2016 re-established in the Christian camp a relative hegemony, of course not as complete as the Shiite one, but comparable to the more relative one on the Sunnite side. This development that practically ended the main Christian rivalry and is often seen as proof of democratic vitality made mandatory for Michel Aoun to be candidate for the presidency that had been vacant for 15 months. Aoun was allied and candidate of Hezbollah, and the same reconciliation hit the 14 Mars party hard. It is the same as what Saad Hariri imposed on March 8th, who was the main figure of this party and who had exchanged his support to Aoun against the promise to be given the presidency of the Council of Ministers. And this old general had received the majority that he needed. Hariri and Jaja now were painstakingly supporting Aoun, but were still hostile to the political line followed by Hezbollah, who, although they were in the Council of Ministers, remained principal ally of the Aounist current, which means that the bones of contention have not disappeared so far. But instead of a trench of yesterday, we now have to deal with a network of barricades, each of them hosting a potential rebel. And most have been built on the table of the Council of Ministers. Outside, only marginal groups remain to play the part of the opposition. In the future, it is probable that the will to preserve the governmental formula that's in place is going to limit the size of small internal wars. It's not going to be enough to reduce the impact of the current changes on intercommunitarian relationships in the country. The mass of the Sunnites nor the Christians are going to accept the rise of Hezbollah, who is taking over attributes of sovereignty, especially the one to wage war inside and outside of the national borders. The trend that other political leaders have and moderate their reaction to this challenge in order to avoid the worst and to maintain the existing partnerships is probably going to make them vulnerable to be overtaken by the fringes. And this last hypothesis is even more plausible because the governments failed one after the other to treat vital problems like the considerable inflation or the lack of energy production, of environmental problems, of waste treatment, and the regional disparities and the social inequalities and unemployment that are growing and are pushing qualified youth outside of the country or are offering them as a docile prey to political leaders. The communitarian system that protects its members and is unwilling to hold corrupt leaders accountable, or ministers and even security organs are trying to transform the different measures into communitarian tendencies that encourage the ministers or security organs at the head of the state. The swollen staffs and corruption are becoming part and parcel of the system. The debt to GDP ratio that maintains this waste, over 140%, is now the third biggest in the world after Japan and Greece, and is even worsened by a growth rate that is diminishing and budget deficit that cannot be reduced however hard one tries. And political polarization has even stopped the publication of regular budgets for 11 years now. Offshore hydrocarbon deposits that had been found 7 years ago are not going to be exploited anytime soon. And the rumor says that this delay is due to disputes over the fees that are asked. The design briefs that are prepared have been found by expert Nicolas Sarkis to sacrifice the national interest and to adopt a partnership formula that is completely outdated and that would probably be explained by the will to work with companies that are interested in order to benefit from enormous kickbacks. Political groups that remain communitarian are confronted with new seismic faults through the whole political society of the same character. The same is true of the coming crisis, and even in a financial upheaval caused by the explosion of the public debt or by the real estate sector could cause communitarian interpretations that are contradictory. However, No group can say that they are innocent when it comes to this rush into the void. When it comes to the discourse, it's the proponents of a laity, be they fake or real, who show an excess of modesty. Dawla al-Mania, like state, is avoided, preferring Dawla Madaniya, that is an inexact translation of the Lockean notion of civil government. By the way, I recalled how this notion has been easily instrumentalized by an Egyptian Salafist. The government disguised in state seems to hide a covered will to laicization that is afraid to say its name. In any event, the governing parties who say that they are at times attached to Dawla Madaniya have never been very determined when it comes to partial measures to take that would make this ultimate goal less fictitious. But the abolition of political communitarianism that is enshrined in the Constitution based on the Taif Agreement, and that the recurrent debates on the electoral law or the claims of a civil option for personal statutes have shown how weak the laic current is in the country. A weakness that the complexity and historical thickness of the network that the communitarian practice has woven would explain easily. It's around individuals or sets of individuals and depriving them of their autonomy. The ultimate modality of relationships between them. However, those ties are very solid and don't avoid uneasiness of different kinds, cannot stop the system from running wild. It has already been giving the impression of being incurably blocked. Internal factors of dysfunctioning are being multiplied by external influence. The system is particularly fond of. The changing game of those influences is hard to forecast, but even more than internal data, it makes a forecast of the horizon of the systemic crisis that we are living difficult. It would be best to keep an overview on the whole wall of Rabbi Moe in order to prepare it, at least on the level of the representation, for all eventualities. Thank you very much for your attention.